Tonight, I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about hibernation, how hibernators survive the winter, how their gut microorganisms are involved in this process, and what all of this can mean for applications in space travel and human medicine. So hibernation is a strategy that some animals will use to survive times of high energy demand and low resource availability, just like the cold winter that's happening right now outside those doors. My hibernator of choice, and the one that I study, is the 13-line ground squirrel. And my first story about the squirrel host begins during the season of summer, a time of plenitude and feasting. These squirrels need to consume an immense amount of food because they need to build up adequate fat stores that they can later use for energy throughout hibernation. So by the end of the summer, a squirrel will typically double its body weight. Once the weather starts getting colder, that's when the squirrel will begin to hibernate. And during this time, the squirrel doesn't eat anything, it doesn't drink anything for 6 months of the year. So throughout hibernation, the squirrel is in a sleep-like state, and it relies primarily on those fat stores that it built up during the summer to fuel it through the winter. And that's how the squirrel survives, is using that fat store. Hibernation is much more complicated than just sleep. There are similarities between the two, though. So both hibernating animals and sleeping mammals are unconscious, and they both experience a decrease in metabolism and body temperature. The difference, though, is that hibernation takes these changes to a much more extreme level. During hibernation, the majority of the time is spent in a state called torpor, which refers to decreased metabolism or metabolic depression. And in 13-line ground squirrels, when they're in torpor, their metabolism can decrease by up to 96%. Which causes their body temperature to also decrease dramatically. So a squirrel's normal body temperature is the same as ours, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. In torpor, however, it drops all the way down to 39 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's these dramatic decreases in metabolism and body temperature that allow the squirrel to conserve an enormous amount of energy, and that's what allows them to subsist off their fat stores for the full 6 months of hibernation. Hibernators and almost all other animals on Earth live in a symbiosis with trillions of microorganisms living in and on them. And this microbial community, or microbiome, has become a popular topic in recent years. And it's this microbiome that's the topic around which my second story is about. So everything that we experience is also experienced by our microbiome. And from the perspective of a hibernator, this means that all of those extreme natural changes in diet and physiology that the squirrel experiences are also dramatic changes in the environment of their microbiome. The microbiome runs into some challenges as soon as the squirrel starts to hibernate. The squirrel starts fasting, which means that the microbes have now lost an important source of energy. The squirrel's body temperature also decreases, which causes a drastic change in the microbe's environment. Hibernation is a really dynamic system or survival strategy that the squirrels use, which means that the microbes are in this very constantly changing environment, and they need to learn to adapt to that to survive. But it's their diversity and their various survival strategies that allows them to survive in hibernation. Some work that my lab and I are doing to help address the question of why do we not see muscle atrophy in hibernators? So they're sleeping, not participating in a lot of physical activity, and they're not eating any protein or eating any food. So how in the world are they maintaining all of that muscle mass? Well, their gut microbiome likely plays an important role. And that's because microbes can recycle nitrogen, which is a key component of amino acids and proteins. But then the question is, what does any of this have to do with space travel or human medicine? So let's start out with space travel, because that's my personal favorite application of hibernation research. So when we talk space travel, I'm talking about being able to induce synthetic torpor in astronauts or other organisms. Synthetic torpor being a hibernation-like state of metabolic depression. If we were able to induce synthetic torpor, that means that we could not only save a considerable amount of energy and resources, but we could also increase the safety for the involved participants. So synthetic torpor in a human would likely be similar to what we see in a brown bear. We would decrease our body temperature by just a couple degrees, but we would be able to save a lot of energy by decreasing metabolism. So, and by doing this successfully, that means that astronauts would use less food, water, and oxygen. And it also means that astronauts would be less susceptible to health problems associated with space travel. So, for example, this would minimize damage caused by space radiation, or minimize bone loss and muscle atrophy from microgravity. From a human medicine perspective, studying hibernators can provide insights into a safer alternative to therapeutic hypothermia. So therapeutic hypothermia has been used for many, many years, and it's used to treat patients with severe injuries, such as trauma patients. And it's usually accomplished by packing down the patient with lots of ice to lower their body temperature, which then causes a decrease in their metabolism. And that's the end goal of therapeutic hypothermia, is to decrease their metabolism. Well, this treatment has a couple potential health complications. Decreasing the body temperature like that can lead to an irregular heartbeat, which can sometimes lead to a heart attack. But you don't see this health complication in hibernators. And hibernation naturally accomplishes this decrease in metabolism in a controlled way. So studying hibernators can help us learn how this may be a safer alternative to therapeutic hypothermia. So as I hope you realize now, studying hibernators and their microorganisms can provide us with so much knowledge that can be used to benefit space travel in human medicine.
I had a question about the synthetic torpor that you'd be putting astronauts in. If you're reducing the amount of oxygen during that period, then you're reducing blood oxygen, which you're then reducing oxygen to the brain. Is that going to cause any sort of brain damage?
So in hibernators like the Arctic ground squirrel, which was the one that can drop their body temperature below freezing, we actually see that in torpor, their brain synapses, or the connections in their brain, actually degrade in torpor. Partially because of the cold, partially because, yes, there's less oxygen available to keep those connections alive and present. But the crazy thing is that in these hibernators, when they enter an interbout arousal, those connections are reformed. So this would be based on the idea that if we could induce a synthetic torpor, we would try to mimic hibernation and torpor and hibernation as much as possible. So if we can understand how hibernators reform those brain connections, then we might be able to make the same thing happen in a human and try to minimize any damage that would happen to the brain caused by the synthetic torpor.
I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more about how the ground squirrels survive without drinking any liquid. It seems more impressive to me than not eating any food for the months and months.
So by decreasing metabolism, they're also decreasing the amount of water that they lose. Because when you're breathing and performing bodily functions, that requires a lot of water. So decreasing metabolism is one way that they can conserve the water that they have left in their body. I think a good example of this is that, so I've been talking about hibernation as it occurs during winter, but that's not the only time that hibernation occurs. You can have hibernating animals that occur in warmer climates, but they hibernate because of water loss. So maybe they're in a warmer climate and then there's a dry season and a drought. So they need to conserve water. This form of hibernation is called estivation, but it's doing the same thing as hibernating in winter, but the goal there is to conserve water rather than to conserve energy.
What kind of a heart rate or respiratory rate are we talking about in the hibernating ground squirrel?
Yes, so in our 13-line ground squirrels, they breathe 1 to 2 times a minute when they're in torpor, and heart rate is only about 2 to 3 times a minute as well. So you can see that. So I used the analogy earlier of torpor being like turning down the thermostat, right? Well, I also like to think of torpor as putting the squirrel into a really slow motion video because everything slows down. Heart rate slows down, and respiration rate also slows down.